Well, welcome and Merry Christmas. We are in the midst of, or at least pretty much the beginning, we're in the second video of this new series. It's the good news, and basically the good news, especially in regards to Christmas and celebrating that. And so, welcome. We just started off this series kind of just pointing out that the gospel, the good news, is not just about a what, but it's also about a who. And you're going to share a little bit on that.
So we kicked off the series last Sunday talking about the who of, and it's not in Whoville. It's the who obviously is Jesus. And but it's interesting to note that in all the prophecies about the Messiah or the coming or the coming Messiah or the Christ, which is a offshoot of the word king.
Yep.
All the prophecies about Jesus were about a coming king. It's not what he came to do, to die on the cross and all those things that he did for us, and the Holy Spirit empowering us to live transformed lives. Those are all sort of what the gospel accomplished.
Right.
But the who of the gospel is actually Jesus. And it's interesting to see that the prophecies about him were about a coming king, and that's who the Jews were expecting. And it's maybe a different view for us to think of Jesus as a king, because the monarchy in our society is, well, in Canada in particular, it's more of a symbol.
It's not really. They don't necessarily have ruling power.
Yeah, they don't need authority or power.
Yeah.
So we're in Jesus' day, and in some countries, still the king does have ultimate authority and power. And then as the king is, so goes the kingdom.
Yeah.
So, and I think we can see in all of the kingdoms of the world, even though some of them start off good, most of them end badly.
Yeah.
Because just the way it's human nature, I think, to take advantage of one's position, decide right and wrong for ourselves, which is original sin, which leads to corruption and then decay. So those are the things that we talked about briefly last week, and how Jesus was different.
Yeah. And so in Christmas we're celebrating Jesus, not just that he is king, but ultimately the kind of king that he is,
and what kind of kingdom he brings.
Right. And then we in the midst of this we celebrate Advent, and so that's how ultimately he is characterized as king, and so somebody who is bringing hope, peace, joy, and love, and so that he is a king that brings those things.
Okay, so today we're going to look at the actual nativity scene, something that's probably up around malls and people's yards and all that stuff at Christmas time. And there's many symbols of that are included in the nativity scene. So we're just going to go through some of those and see what they mean today.
And I'm sure we've had a lot of those in growing up. I know I did.
Yep.
My parents, and I think they still have it, is a really rustic looking one with little statues of Jesus and in a manger, Mary and Joseph, and the barn looked the stable looked very, very barn-like. And I would add action figures to it. Yep.
We have more cartoony one, I guess. That's with little figures, and then I actually have an inflatable one for my lawn. So.
Oh, do you really? That's perfect. Yeah, I a couple of years ago I added Will Ferrell from More Cowbell, even though the Little Drummer Boy is not at all in any nativity scene. I figured it needed a modern update, and Will Ferrell saying More Cowbell was that. But here's the thing: the nativity scene itself, though a wonderful tradition and very much associated with this Christmas season, is not a snapshot found in the Gospels per se. When we read Luke chapter 2, which has a lot of elements of these things, but things like the three wise men, and we'll get more into that, they're not present at all in Luke's telling of the story. And it's not just sort of like, they come a little late. They're not mentioned at all.
I think Matthew mentions them.
Matthew mentions it, exactly. And however, the elements that are present, do speak to the good news of the coming of Jesus.
Yeah.
And each element that are in the nativity scene, even though, again, they don't necessarily kind of play out that way when we read Luke 2, they do speak to something, whether it's the manger, the shepherds, the angel, Mary and Joseph, the wise men, or the magi.
Sure.
Jesus himself, they speak to components of what and who the good news is. And throughout the series, we kind of want to look around that, just looking at that symbol of nativity scene and kind of what it's kind of can be all about.
Okay, so the nativity scene, where did it come from? Where did it first become part of our modern culture?
Well, it seems to have sort of like more or less how we kind of know it.
Yeah.
It kind of seems to start with Saint Francis of Assisi, and he's credited of creating what's called the first live nativity scene in 1223. So it's been here. So it's been around for a while.
Yep.
And in that, it's very likely he did use some people. There could have been statues. There's definitely some different thoughts and all that sort of stuff. Possibly real animals. But you saw in that staging, what you saw was basically a stable, or in that case, I guess it was more of a cave that they used. You had the manger with Jesus in it. You had Mary and Joseph and some animals. And that was it.
Yep.
Apparently he used candlelight to kind of just set the mood. And the reason it was set up was kind of to bring to life the story.
Sure.
And with the desire to stir up things like reverence and gratitude, devotion, and understanding.
Okay.
And humbleness definitely was the theme that he really wanted to convey in that. And that is essentially where we kind of see the nativity scene really kind of starts, even though there's definitely elements depicted in art that predates what St. Francis did. Like we probably have seen, through different pictures, all that, just, a painting of Mary carrying infant Jesus.
Baby Jesus, yeah.
There's things like that, but this is where it sort of started to bring it all together. And it would be in the coming years that other artists and church communities would adopt and depict the scene, and they would add things like the shepherd, the angels, and what we know as the wise men. And that's seems to be about around 14th century is where we see these additions become a little more common. So that really isn't that big of a difference. Maybe 100 years you're starting to see nativity scene more often, and again, it's encompassing a little bit more of what we know today.
Sure. And today, many churches do a live sort of nativity, and they bring in real camels and cows and sheep, and have angels, men on wire with wings stringing around over the stage and all that kind of stuff. So it is definitely a tradition that's carried on through today.
Very much so.
Yep.
And so the nativity scene has a good news message.
Okay.
So often when we read things like Luke 2 at Christmas, it's normal to do this at a Christmas Eve service, or if you're in a tradition that does a Christmas Day service. Yep. I know families, I've definitely done this with my family, who will often read this kind of before the celebration of opening presents, to the great delight of every child salivating the sight of presents.
Come on, Dad.
Yeah, just trying to okay. Yeah. You're just could you read this faster?
You open the presents now?
Yeah, that's right. And what we're going to do right now, we're just take a moment and we're going to read that now. Okay. Just to sort of kind of get us a little bit of a setup for that. And we're going to read it from the New Testament for Everyone version.
Okay.
All right. So, at the time, a decree was issued by Augustus Caesar. A census was taken of the whole world. This was the first census before the one when Quirinius was governor of Syria. So everyone set off to be registered, each in their own town. Joseph, too, who belonged to the house of the family of David, went from the city of Nazareth in Galilee to Bethlehem in Judea, David's city, to be registered with his fiancée Mary, who was pregnant. So that's where they were when the time came for her to have a baby. And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him up and put him to rest in a feeding trough, because there was no room for them in the normal living quarters. There were shepherds in that region, out in the open, keeping the night watch around their flock. An angel of the Lord stood in front of them. The glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. "Don't be afraid," the angel said to them. "Look, I've got good news for you, news which will make everyone very happy. Today, a Savior has been born for you, the Messiah, the Lord, in David's town. This will be a sign for you. You will find the baby wrapped up and lying in a feeding trough." Suddenly, with the angel, there was a crowd of heavenly armies, and they were praising God, saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and peace upon earth among those in his favor." So when the angel had gone away again into the heavens, the shepherds said to each of them, "Well then, let's go to Bethlehem and see what's all about. All this that the Lord has told us." So they hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the child lying in a feeding trough. When they saw it, they told them that what had been said to them about the child. And all the people who heard it were amazed at the things the shepherds said to them. But Mary treasured all these things and mused them over in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all that they had heard and seen, as it had been told to them.
Yep. So in the story, we see all the elements we've been talking about.
We see a lot of them, yeah.
Yeah, we see Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus.
Yep.
And a manger, a feeding trough in this translation.
I think that's good to have there, because I think it's not a word we use in almost any other context in a lot of that. So I think people can lose what a manger was.
Yeah, exactly. It's depicted in a lot of the nativities as sort of a special, isolated little thing for the baby, and almost like
it looks very
special
crib-like.
crib. Yeah, exactly. Where really it was literally a feeding trough.
Yeah. You see the shepherds, but it's interesting what's missing. So especially when we think of the nativity scene, what's missing? So let's look at the angels. Quite often, an angel's in the nativity. Yes, they're a part of the story. They appear to the shepherds in the field. They also appear to Mary in Luke 1, where they tell her that she's going to give birth to Jesus, and Joseph in Matthew 1. So it's an important part of the story.
Aren't in Bethlehem. Yeah.
You don't see that at all. There's no, again, if there's somebody was taking a snapshot of that moment, there doesn't seem to be an angel there. Mm-hmm. There's just no mention of them. They're in the field at any point. But then you have the wise men or the Magi. Yeah. Luke doesn't. Again, what we said, Luke doesn't talk about them all at all. In fact, they are found in Matthew 2.
Yeah.
They do find Jesus in Bethlehem. They do present 3 gifts. There's no mention of how many there are.
Yeah.
Tradition, actually, I've read this a few different places, would say they're probably anywhere from 10 to 30 is a possibility. So the idea of there being 3 most likely comes from
the three kinds of gifts. Yeah.
And that, if you wanted to make a manger or whatever nativity scene with 30 extra people, it'd be a little crowded.
Yeah, and it also shows that, or says in Matthew, that it was a period of time after. It could be up to 2 years later. So they certainly weren't in the room with the baby Jesus just born and the shepherds all together. Yeah,
there's no interaction with shepherds. It's other than it mentions that they saw him in Bethlehem. That's all we have the indication.
Yep.
But they do play a huge part in that overarching story of Jesus coming. Matthew 2:11, when talking about these magi, these wise men, however you want to call them, it says they went into the house and saw the child with Mary, his mother. They fell down and worshipped him. They opened their treasure chests and gave him presents, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Mm-hmm. So in all that, they recognized the kingship, they worshipped him, and they actually gave him gifts that were royal in nature. So they play a huge part. But also the important note here, and we'll get into this when we actually talk about them specifically, they're Gentiles.
Yeah, they're not Jews.
They're not Jewish at all.
Yeah.
But I think it's when we look at this whole idea in the idea of the bigger picture. The nativity scene, again, is not a snapshot of an actual scene presented in the Bible. Hmm. And this can trip some people up. I know I've been there.
Yep.
It is, however, a picture that speaks of the overarching narrative of Jesus' kingship, in how it's really presented in the scene can really speak to the good news of Jesus.
Mm-hmm. So again, even probably St. Francis at the time, who was a monk, would know that they weren't all together in one spot at the same time, but just to have them present to help tell the story, maybe.
Yeah,
and to make sure that it would help people remember the elements of the story, because they didn't necessarily have the written, or people couldn't even read back then. So,
no, and that it very much helps all the all kind of the people in that time as they build that story, and they add again the elements, say, of again the Magi, which is coming from Matthew, of just sort of like, hey, let's bring that in, because they're, even though again it's not a picture of exactly what happened, it is a kind of a picture of the overarching story that is happening, and the message to be brought. And that message kind of like, really, I think it's John 1:14 that encapsulates it really well. It is, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. We gazed upon his glory, the glory like that of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Not just that he lived among us, but how he would be amongst us. And so that's kind of just the idea of the setup for the Nativity. We are acknowledging that, yes, the Nativity isn't a straight ripped out of the Bible kind of story. We see elements of it throughout there, and it does paint, I think, a bigger picture that helps us, I think, in the celebration. And so over the next few weeks, we are going to sort of just kind of look at some of those different elements, like the shepherds, like Mary and Joseph, like the Magi, like the angel, and just kind of the good news message that they bring, that as we see them represented in the nativity scene, that they are bringing something to this whole story, this good news story.
And how the good news is good news for them, and how that sort of relates to us today. How we perceive the good news of Jesus because of the different elements in the story. And to me, I think it just helps us maybe have a fuller understanding and be able to celebrate Christmas maybe in a slightly different way when it comes to Jesus. And I'm really looking forward to this.
Well, and I'm hoping that too is, as you know, I know I can get into this, like sometimes when you're so used to a certain picture, symbol, whatever, it can kind of lose its meaning. And I'm hoping in this we can sort of reinvigorate some of that meaning. So when we look at, I know for me, really important, when we look at that scene, nativity scene, whether it's a decoration on your tree or something on a mantle or something like that, or inflatable in the front of your house, that it's more than just another Christmas decoration, that there's symbol and story even in that.
And help us appreciate it. So, well, we are hoping you're going to join us for the rest of this series as we move through the different weeks in December. And so please like and subscribe, and we'll see you for the next one.